Hello, everyone, wherever you are in the world. My name is Benjamin Hopkins, and I'm a professor of history here at the George Washington University. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's fantastic event, which is one of our regular New Books in Asian Studies series. Normally, when we do our New Books in Asian Studies, we have a single author discussing their work, but today we're in for a particular treat where actually we have an edited volume. And included amongst our panel is the editor, Neilesh Bose, as well as two of the contributing authors, Andrea Wright and Danielle Carrasco, who are going to be talking about their individual contributions to the work as well as how it fits together in a whole. So it's really promises to be a fantastic conversation between these three authors. A couple of ground rules before we get started. As a reminder, this is being recorded and it will be later posted to the Sigur Center website for your availability later to view on YouTube. Throughout the presentation, please feel free to put any questions, comments, or anything like that that you may have in the Q&A box, which should be on the right-hand side of your panel. When you do put a comment or a question in, if you can please identify yourself and any affiliation you might have, that will be extremely helpful. After the authors are done with their presentations, we'll then turn it to an open Q&A, and I'll dig into those questions. So at any point in time during the presentations, if you have questions, comments, any topics you'd like to bring up for discussion, please feel free to put them there and I will pick them up. At this point, it gives me great pleasure to hand the event over to my friend and colleague, Neilesh Bose, who's a professor at the University of Victoria in British Columbia. He's the editor of today's work and will lead today's discussion. So over to you, Neilesh.
Thank you so much to Ben and to Rebecca Russell and to my co-panelists, Andrea Wright and Danielle Carrasco, here with us today. It's a great privilege for me to be able to talk about this book, which I have edited, titled South Asian Migrations in Modern Global History, Labor, Law, and Wayward Lives. Within the broader region of South Asia, the nation state of India today is the source of the largest numbers of migrants annually. Up until the beginning of the pandemic, about 30 million migrants leaving India each year by the last count by 2019, and one of the largest sources of remittances back into the home country annually. And today I'll briefly introduce the history of this phenomenon, including aspects of micro-histories of individuals as well as legal histories of immigration from India, before turning it over to two contributors to the book. The approach taken in this book, as the title suggests, places South Asian migrations into a history of globalization. Such a topic of South Asian migrations in that kind of a context brings to light many different types of migrations within South Asia and outside of it, so that it is impossible to cover everything in one discussion. But the book offers a framework, that of how the state in India regulated migrations of people out of India from the early 19th century in the era of the East India Company through the early 20th in the era of the British Empire, spanning the company and the imperial periods, offering a window into major types of migration and regulations of such migrations in the era of the globalized 19th century. So the modern experiences of migration of people from South Asia begins, as I mentioned there, in the 1830s. This is where the book begins, the decade in which the British Empire began to abolish transatlantic slavery and replace that system with an indentured labor system focused on India, with laborers being gathered from various parts of India and then sent out from different points on the eastern coast, from Chennai and Kolkata, to various points in the world, such as places in Africa, the Caribbean, the Pacific, and South America. And this system lasted formally until the late 1910s. And though traces of it existed in the 1820s, the formal indentured labor system vis-a-vis India with legal regulations was designed in 1837 to help the British imperial economic system and the planters who had benefited from it to create a legal instrument to ensure large-scale, systematic, and state-sponsored migration from India to fulfill the planters' production needs. And it was driven not only by the need to provide an abundant supply of labor, but also to create a system of protection to laborers. And laborers initially were recruited under an initial and extendable agreement for 5 years, after which they were free to return back to India or to settle into other colonies. Many of the Indian laborers would also stay in the destination country beyond their 5-year contracts. And recruitment of these laborers would happen through a variety of systems, many of which predated the rise of indenture. But in most systems, recruiters would locate likely candidates and at times use false information over the location, the nature of work, and the scale of wages offered to laborers in points of destination. Now, in addition to only indentured laborers, Indian nationalists, of course, featured as a significant part of this world of migration, as well as others within imperial service, such as members of the military, soldiers, workers, guards, and policemen from the early 19th century through the end of the British Empire in the 1940s. Another is the world of students who, in the modern world, often overlapped with another category, that of anti-colonial nationalists, who traversed borders of various types from the late 19th century onward. Finally, the experience of laborers migrating to and engaging with different forms of work and settlement in the Gulf, beginning around the turn of the 20th century and intensifying in the late 20th century through the present, comprises a final grouping for the purposes of historical analysis. Scattered throughout this time period, one would find capitalists and entrepreneurs of various types. And from the middle of the 20th century, in the context of forced migration, because of the partition of colonial India as one, as refugees. Now, each of these types of migrations would entail their own kinds of investigations. And rather than delve into each type, which would take very long, I would now focus on just discussing some of the methods that are contained within this book that showcase how scholars today have been discussing the roles of these migrations in a framework of global history. So, as covered in the book, new research has focused on 3 particular directions. One is labor history, another is the history of biography, and another is legal history, which is where I will end. Contributors to the book in the scope of labor history have focused on the transformative nature of the indentured labor system as one within the lives of migrants themselves, as well as some of the new elements that that system brought to the history of labor in the context of India and its multifaceted diasporas, such as contracts, which emerged not only in English, but through numerous vernacular languages in the context of indentured labor in the 19th century, as well as the new form of consent. However much it was often not applied, it did exist on paper in the 19th century vis-a-vis laborers exiting India in this time period. Chapters in the book focus on this topic, such as a work by the scholar Ashutosh Kumar, who studies regulations around food provisions in the journeys of laborers from India to various parts of the world, demonstrating a measure, in Kumar's argument, a measure of freedom and possibility, however limited, for indentured laborers in the context of emergent legal changes in the 19th century. And then one of our panelists here today, Andrea, will speak about this subject at some level in her presentation, and her work shows continuities of various types from the era of indenture to the present day landscape of Indian laborers, as well as laborers from other parts of South Asia, in the Gulf, in particular in Bahrain, through a historical anthropology of the precarious condition of laborers in the present. Another section of this book, which showcases recent research in this area, is the world of biography. They are a source of interesting new work from the work of Gayatri Bahadur, whose 2013 book, Coolie Woman, offers a historical reflection on her great-grandmother's journeys and various interactions with different parts of the indentured labor system, and was sent to Guyana in the early 20th century, as well as her own migrations from Guyana to the United States of America from her own perspective. Another example is that of Samia Khatun, whose work Australia Nama offers an analysis of how South Asians have migrated to and been embedded inside of Australian society since at least the middle of the 19th century. This book includes studies of lesser-known individuals who span the spectrum of the historical landscape, but emerge in that history of the late 19th through the early 20th centuries, such as Taraknath Dash, a globe-trotting Indian anti-colonial nationalist who studied in the United States in the early 20th century. He entered North America in 1906 vis-a-vis Japan, and applied for citizenship 3 times, was denied for various reasons in his first 2 tries, then received citizenship in 1914 in the US, and worked tirelessly for many Indian nationalist causes, as well as earned one of the first PhDs at Georgetown's School for Foreign Service in 1925, and lived most of his life up until his death in 1958 in the United States. Another fascinating figure includes Pandura Kankoje, the subject of Danielle Carrasco's work, who's with us here, of the same generation as Dash, migrated to the United States in the early 20th century, joined the Ghadar movement like Dash did, but then traveled to and stayed in Mexico just during and after the Mexican Revolution and lived there from the 1920s to the 1950s. As Danielle will discuss, Kankoje's political, professional, and family trajectories developed outside only a national or a colonial set of alliances or allegiances. Finally, individuals like Senthamani Govender, who is profiled in this book, was born in 1923 in the midst of racially segregated colonial South Africa. And she grew up in the apartheid system, which was formally put into place in the late 1940s as South Africa was urbanizing and expanding. And like many others, lived under the constant threat of repatriation to India, which was a major theme for South Africa from the 1920s through the 1960s. She and her family and many others lived and worked in South Africa during and after this period, and is not only a child of indenture, as her father was an indentured labor, but of the local South African landscape, as the work in this book argues. I'll now turn to the last section of this book, which is that of legal history. And in the work, there are various chapters which explore different elements of legal history vis-a-vis Indian migrants, such as chapters by Riyad Koya, who works on the end of indenture, and Marina Martin, who works on legal categorizations in early 20th century South Africa. The legal history of this topic conventionally begins with the regulation of emigration out of India in the 1830s, that pivotal decade of the end of transatlantic slavery, through the 1983 Emigration Act, which was instituted by independent India, an update to one of the later acts of 1922, created in Imperial India. From the 1830s, the company state of India regulated emigration from various ports, such as Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay, and covered terms of contract, the means of transport, and the need to return migrants at the end of service. In the early 1840s, 1842, a protector of Indian immigrants was appointed to ensure that the laborers had adequate space, food, water, and ventilation on the journey. From the 1840s, not only the protector, but other positions were created that exist in some form today in independent India, such as medical workers, recruitment agents, and magistrates that were deputed solely for the purpose of regulating emigration. In British Imperial India in 1883, an updated Emigration Act continued in this vein, but included an official distinction that would last until 1983, and that is the distinction between land and sea. So only those who emigrated by sea were monitored, and those by land were not regulated within this system. None of the regions conquered by the British Empire in the Middle East were listed in the 1883 Act, and Indian companies that were interested in the region began to lobby to send laborers there underneath these protections. as petroleum interests based in India and throughout British imperial sites pushed for laborers from India, emigration was authorized first from Karachi to the Gulf in 1904. Delayed, though, because of the Great War, but in motion since the 1910s, was a proposal to end the indentured labor system. And the system began to crack as indentured labor stopped flowing to Natal in South Africa in 1911. And immediately after the war, the Immigration Act of 1922 was passed, which abolished the indentured labor system. That system had been responsible for roughly 3 million individuals to be shipped out of India in the preceding century. But the Act of 1922 only covers so-called unskilled laborers, which in the terms of that act referred to so-called agricultural labor. But skilled workers in the language of that law, such as those who worked in education and in other such professions, were not affected by this law. The Office of the Immigration Agent and immigration depots were eliminated, and they had been a mainstay of the century before. Unskilled work was mentioned in this act. It was defined as, quote, engaging in agriculture, and skilled work included clerks and shop assistants. If we move to the post-colonial era, migrants in that time frame, the immediate world of decolonization, was a time of national struggles and independence movements in various parts of Africa and the Pacific outside of India. Expulsions of Indians had taken place, of those who had been living in those regions for various reasons, in some cases for decades, in some cases for centuries, but these were not seen as a part of the new Indian state's purview around immigration. But because of an increase in abuses of migrants in the 1950s to 1970s period, in particular in the Gulf, a region with increasing Indian and other South Asian migrants from the early post-colonial era, the Indian state revised the 1922 law in 1983. And a crucial aspect of this law is that it defines emigration as the, quote, departure out of India of any person with a view to taking up any employment in any country or place outside of India. And to protect the most vulnerable at the destination countries, the Indian government created new regulatory processes based on educational qualifications and the destination country. Those who intended to migrate to countries with an educational qualification lower than Class 10 were required since 1983 to get an immigration clearance if they were heading to certain countries on the list that the Indian government produced, such as the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, as well as states in Southeast Asia like Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand. Again, this is from 1983. The history of migration that I have very briefly tracked here has stuck mostly to British imperial lanes from the 1830s to the 1920s, but from the early 20th century shifted into more intensified linkages to the Gulf through our present time. Also in the 20th century, the United States of America became a more prominent geopolitical actor from the mid to the late 20th century. And the United States of America also figures prominently in the history of educational exchanges, the travels and travails of students, scholars, and educationists from the mid-20th century onward. Distinctions of, quote, skilled and, quote, unskilled from 1983 stayed and are still in place, but from 1983, the so-called unskilled were defined as agricultural workers as well as industrial workers. And this distinction figures in other countries outside of India, most of which changed their immigration acts around the same time. Pakistan and after 1971, Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, all of them modeled their immigration laws after India, and all of them changed from the late 1970s onward and maintained the so-called skilled and unskilled distinction. To end my brief presentation here, the significance of South Asian migrations in a global historical context lies in the ways that the Indian state drew from and had to respond to the fact of so many migrants living, working, and charting various lives outside of India that had important effects in host societies as well as in India itself. Legal history, labor history, as well as the close micro-histories of individuals like Dash, Kankojay and Govender, show how India's role in a global history of migration has changed from the 19th centuries through the present. Though the symbolic register of migrants has changed without a doubt, if we compare the times of Nehru in the early post-colonial era to the times of Modi in the 21st century, the legal apparatus through which migrants are regulated by state forces owes its origins to that late imperial period of the 1920s. And future scholars of migrations doubtlessly will focus on how the changes of this pivotal time in the 20th century continues to inform migration policies and patterns today. And on that note, I will end my presentation and now turn over to our remaining panelists, and we'll start with Andrea Wright at the College of William and Mary.
Thank you so much, Neilesh, for putting this book together. I'm trying to share my screen, which is the pause. But I thank you so much. It's such a joy to be part of this really very interesting discussion of South Asian migrations and global history, and also to be presenting here today. And thank you, Ben and Rebecca, for all the work you did to put this together. The chapter that I contributed called Imperial Labor grows out of my own research, which looks at the immigration of individuals who are categorized as unskilled or semi-skilled from India to work in the oil fields of the Arabic-speaking Persian Gulf. And those countries in particular are Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Oman, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Every year, approximately 1 million Indian men today obtain permission from the Protector of Immigrants in order to emigrate to those countries because, as Neilesh told us, there's a requirement to get that permission if one hasn't gone through 10th grade or class 10. So I want to think about that migration within a longer context. And I'm going to start in 1938, which is 6 years after oil is first discovered in the Arabic-speaking Persian Gulf. And it's discovered in Bahrain in 1932. 6 years after it's discovered, in 1938, the workers at that oil field held their first organized strikes. The fact that workers went on strike to agitate for better working conditions should not be surprising. And of course, there's strikes globally by workers at this time. But wait, what may be surprising is that these strikes involved a coalition of workers that included not only Bahrainis or other Arab workers, but also Indians. In fact, after Bahrainis, British Indians were the largest nationality working at the Bahrain Petroleum Company, which was an American-owned company. There were 352 British Indians working at the company, which was 13% of the oil company's workforce. And this number of British Indians outnumbered all Americans, Canadians, and British workers combined. These Indians in Bahrain were just a few of the increasing numbers of Indians working in the Gulf's oil industry. And by 1950, approximately 1,500 Indians worked in oil and related industries in the Arabic-speaking Gulf. While we might not be surprised by the strikes of workers in 1938, what we might be surprised by is that worker strikes to affect change in the working conditions today in the Gulf are extremely rare. And this is a map of the areas in which I'm talking about. And this, of course, is the Gulf of Bahrain. And in Dubai on March 10th, 2015, a few hundred South Asian construction workers took to the streets to protest their working conditions. Within hours, the Dubai police issued a statement that the workers had returned to work. In my chapter, I examined the processes that have led such large numbers of South Asians to work as laborers in the Gulf, but also the reasons for the precarious positions which these laborers occupy. Often, and I'm pushing against two reasons that are often discussed, and they're interrelated. One is that the reasons for the large numbers of Indians in the Gulf and for their poor treatment has to do with an economic model of surplus and scarcity. There's a story that, the Gulf has a surplus of oil and a surplus of money, but a scarcity of workers. In contrast, South Asia has a surplus of workers, but a scarcity of jobs. This pairs with a highly localized view of the Gulf, which sees the Gulf as particular or exceptional, and often attributes the poor treatment of workers to local Arab culture. In contrast to those two arguments, I argue that colonial labor mobilities, racialized hierarchies, and attempts to evacuate politics from the oil fields all contributed to the current both labor makeup in the Gulf, but also the working conditions there. And in order to do so, I reframe Indian migration within global capital movements in the 19th and 20th century. I draw on work by Lisa Lowe and Radhika Manjia, and I'm interested in the connections, as Lisa Lowe is, between colonialism, slavery, liberalism, and trade, and how the colonial logics of labor were shaped by colonial subjugation, liberal philosophy, and racialized divisions of humanity. Central to colonial governments in the moves from slavery to indentured to contract labor were the contradictory tensions between liberal ideologies of free labor and racialized categorizations that characterize some people as, quote, unfit for liberty, unquote. Liberal ideologies and racialized hierarchies worked in conjunction with the techniques and technologies developed to regulate colonial migration. And these techniques and technologies informed contemporary understandings of liberty. And as Manjia describes, the signing of contracts becomes a definitive element of freedom. Now, my examination of Indian migration to the oil fields traces these colonial logics into the 20th and 21st centuries and attends to the central role of colonial infrastructure and these logics in shaping contemporary labor precarity. In the case of migrant labor to the Gulf, the interplay of labor, security, and imperialism show us the enduring legacies of these apparatuses in shaping contemporary neoliberal security regimes. We must place this within a context of the 20th century in which Middle Eastern oil becomes increasingly associated with national security. Great Britain attempts to secure the nations and oil companies' rights to Gulf oil and control oil production. Oil companies and the British administration in the Gulf mobilized the indentured system apparatuses to move indentured workers. They mobilized the apparatuses that were used to move indentured workers from India to the British colonies in the 19th century, and they revitalized in the 20th century to move contract labor from India to the Gulf's oil fields in the 20th century. This becomes all the more important when, after 1951, Iran nationalized its oil industry for a very brief period between 1951 and 1953. But when oil was nationalized there, it included the nationalization of the oil refinery in Abidan, which was at the time the single largest financial investment of the British Empire outside of Great Britain. And it was caused in part by large strikes of workers, which included both Iranian and Arabic-speaking workers, but also workers from South Asia. And all of these workers together created these very disruptive strikes. And so what we see is in the 1950s and 1960s, as oil is becoming an object of security, national security, and there's this tension with nationalization, the ability of Indians workers in the Gulf to collectively organize becomes increasingly curtailed. In part, this is due to the efficiency of the labor recruiting system, the same system that moved indentured laborers. That same infrastructure is able to easily move lots of workers from rural parts of India to the Gulf. And in addition, the system was legitimated through contracts that were approved by the Indian government. The robust nature of the recruiting system ensured there were large numbers of Indians available to work, and the situation led to what one oil company manager instructed his staff to hire only Indians and Pakistanis because, quote, they can be fired without any problem at all, unquote. So in my chapter, one of the sites that I look at are strikes by Indian workers employed by British Petroleum who are building a refinery in Aden in 1950s. And there we see company management and the Indian government relied on employment contracts to undermine worker complaints and threatened to replace workers with those that they could easily replace with using the recruitment system. When workers appealed to the Indian government as a means to address their labor situation, the Indian government temporarily halted recruitment for the Aden refinery, but due to pressure from British Petroleum, the Indian government then quickly reopened recruitment. So instead, the Indian bureaucrats working in the Indian government said that to help protect workers, what they should do is emphasize informing potential immigrants of their working conditions. This information, these government officials argued, would ensure migrants were, quote, freely consenting, unquote, to their contracts and alleviate the government from responsibility. So, for example, government officials in New Delhi asked the protector of immigrants in Bombay to warn workers of the situation abroad so that they might choose not to go in the first place. And here we see the practices of both government officials and oil company managers relies on this idea of an informed signing of a contract. Now, for their part, oil company managers also argued that the conditions that contracts legitimated working conditions. In this case in Aden and in other places, managers argued workers should have signed contracts and traveled to Aden. They should not have signed contracts, and they should not have come to Aden if they were unhappy with the terms of those contracts. Now, through such an argument, managers claimed that the differences in treatment and the differences in pay between employees, whereas Indian workers were not paid as much as workers from Europe in particular, they said, despite that these were based on nationality, they said that Indian workers had agreed to it, and so that's the way it was, and that even as management were paying people differently, they refused to acknowledge national employee unions. Now, this argument that signing a contract was a way to legitimated worker treatment is very common, and in some ways it very much naturalizes the colonial racialized hierarchies that had shaped oil company management. Through arguing the importance of the contract, managers elided how racism and these racialized hierarchies were mobilized to control the workforce. And it also, these arguments justified inequalities with an argument that echoed the colonial discourses of some people as being unfit for freedom. So if we move to the 1960s, and this is some workers in Wright, I believe. In the 1960s, a series of strikes by Gulf Arab workers who were also working in oil projects were characterized as threats to national security. And as a result, Gulf governments, as well as British and American oil companies, worked together to reduce the impact of further strikes. Frustrated by the lost revenue and fearful of nationalization projects, oil companies increasingly focused on the stability of the workforce, both in the oil fields and in the industries providing support for oil production. Workforce stability, oil company managers, and the British administration argued, was a central feature of political stability. And what results is an evacuation of politics from the oil fields through the replacement wholesale of local workers with precarious South Asians, who today compose the majority of laborers at oil projects. Now, to conclude, non-local Gulf Arab workers are those who are non-citizens in the Gulf are excluded from political and cultural milieu of the Gulf states, and foreigners' ability to access state resources and participate in governance is limited. For Indian migrants to the Gulf, this means there are no strong labor laws to protect them, and there are legal structures that formalize their exclusion. Increasing securitization and the use of colonial infrastructure used to move indentured workers facilitated this evacuation of the politics from the Gulf's oil fields. From the 1940s to the 1970s, the composition of the workforce shifts markedly from being both local nationals and South Asians to exclusively South Asians, and with the explicit hope by oil company managers and colonial bureaucrats to create workforce stability. This shift was not merely a consequence of the new wealth from oil production or industry manpower needs. Rather, colonial racial hierarchies, labor mobilities, and colonial infrastructures continue to shape immigration policies and contracts. These colonial legacies are also deeply imbricated in neoliberal security regimes. And so today, the consent of workers, in conjunction with the securitization of the state around oil, means that workers have limited rights, and the loss of these rights is framed as consensual and necessary. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Andrea. I think now we will turn to Danielle Carrasco, who teaches at the National University of Mexico City, UNAM.
Hi, thank you, Nilesh. I'll just start projecting the image here. Hi, hello everyone. I can't see much of the audience, but I'm very happy to be here, and I want to first of all thank Nilesh for inviting me to write a chapter for his book and to be here today to talk about it. And also, I want to thank Rebecca and Ben for putting together this event and allowing us to link up despite being so far away. Okay, so I'll start talking about my chapter in the book, and I'll start by saying that Nilesh's invitation initially surprised me, and I was taken aback. I had been interested for some time in the improbable links between Mexico, my own country, and my region, Latin America, and South Asia. In my view, these links go back to the beginning itself of modernity, when both regions were brought together in the imagination of the West by being associated with the word India or Indian. But that's a different story. Maybe we can talk about that later. However, I had never been interested or well versed in the study of migration or the history of migration. And in Mexico, migration studies mainly focus on Mexican migration to the US, and sometimes also on different exile communities that settled in Mexico during the 20th century, mainly from Europe and the more whiter countries of South America. In South Asia, on the other hand, migration histories focus mainly on the Indian Ocean, as we have just seen, Southeast Asia, and in historical terms, in the networks created by colonialism in Africa, Europe, and less so North America. I was so ill-equipped to write about such matters. However, Nilesh's enthusiasm prompted me to think more deeply about my own research, and I ended up trying my best and writing a piece on the fascinating life of P.S. Kankoje, who you can see in the picture here, and a very important and eminent Mexican scientist of Indian origins. I undertook a more micro-historical and biographical approach and tried to look at the what I call the extra-colonial circuits and networks through which South Asian migrants and other colonial subjects moved during the early 20th century. Kankoje was an exceptionally audacious migrant, and his trajectory, I soon realized, helped us to pose important questions about nationalist historiographies of both Mexico and India, but also the histories of South Asian anti-colonial networks that we are used to. In the chapter that I wrote, I posed that in Mexico, the markers of colonial difference that had defined Kankoje's early life as an imperial subject were erased by his participation in the consolidation of a modernist project of nation building and his ambiguous and strange relationship with Mexican mestizo national identity. As a result of his engagement with different political and ideological and scientific trends, Kankoje was able to escape the networks of control and surveillance forged by British colonialism across different parts of the planet, and which had marked the fate of the majority of South Asian migrants in the Age of Empire. His life story stands out as a fascinating anomaly in the history of early 20th century transcontinental migration. He originally set foot in America in 1906 in San Francisco. The West Coast was by then a region marked by great ideological and political effervescence and profound anti-imperialist activity. The sites and networks of exchange fostered by groups such as the famous Wobblies, the International Workers of the World, were especially meaningful for those who, like Kankoje, came from non-Western regions and who, in North America, were able, perhaps for the first time, to think of their struggle against colonialism as an interconnected and transnational, transcontinental enterprise. In many ways, the story of Kankoje's comrades in the west coast of North America in those years is a kind of precedent to the later different kinds of third world solidarities that emerged after the 1950s. During his time in the US and the west coast of North America, Kankoje was surprised to confirm that he was often mistaken for a Mexican and was rarely grouped with other immigrants brought together under the label of Asians. This was a first moment of closeness with a very distant people. Many of the Mexican workers that he encountered formed part of the Partido Liberal Mexicano, an anarcho-syndicalist group well known through the work of their most important organizers, Ricardo and Enrique Flores Magón. This initial experience of phenotypical and ideological closeness that Hancoye had paved the way for his eventual move to Mexico in 1924. He eventually became a naturalized Mexican citizen 6 years later in 1930. It is very important to state that despite the formal and symbolic recognition of Indian citizenship that he was awarded later in his life in the 1950s, the only non-colonial form of identity, official identity, that Hancoye had for most of his life was that of a Mexican citizen. Despite the political devotion formed as a radical young nationalist in Maharashtra, Hancoye was practically and experientially a Mexican for most of his life. The period in which he came to Mexico in the 1920s was a fascinating moment. Mexico City was a hub of radical internationalism and a veritable emporium of exiles and revolutionaries. An eloquent example of the coming together of the cosmopolitan and volatile political atmosphere of the time is the creation of the Mexican Communist Party that was founded by a motley crew of US pacifists, Soviet envoys, and of course the famous Bengali ideologue M.N. Roy. During the following decade, the 1920s, Mexico also became the home and place of operation for figures like Augusto César Sandino from Nicaragua, Farabundo Martí from El Salvador, Julio Antonio Mella from Cuba, and Italian photographer Tina Molotti. However, despite belonging to this large and vocal community, Hancoye presents us with a fascinating exception among radical exiles in early post-revolutionary Mexico. Unlike his Latin American colleagues and comrades, who remained politically active during their stay in Mexico, Hancoye was forced to distance himself from the struggle of anti-colonialism in British India. He left active politics and instead focused on his scientific career. I think that due to this, he's a kind of absent figure, of course, in Indian national historical accounts. He is also absent from the many accounts of the Ghadar party. He has a very small role in all of those. And of course, he is surprisingly absent in Mexican historiography, despite the very important role he played in consolidating what the Mexican regime called post-revolutionary national agriculture. However, Hancoye was an internationalist avant la lettre, blending the thrusts of radical anti-colonial Indian nationalism, anarcho-syndicalism, and communism, and the ideas of figures like Gangadhar Tilak, Ricardo Flores Magón, and Lenin. Hancoye found many ways to become useful for the project of revolution. He was an anti-colonial activist, a modernist scientist, an anarchist organizer, and a radical educator. Deeply tied to the land and agriculture, though not to any land in particular, Hancoye was a figure condemned to internationalism. Unlike many of his comrades and contemporaries like M.K. Gandhi, Aurobindo Ghosh, Virendranath Chattopadhyaya, or Lala Hardayal, who moved among a multi-centered network of margins constituted by imperial power, Hancoye effectively subtracted himself from the global circuits of surveillance and anti-colonial activism that joined India, Europe, South Africa, the Caribbean, and North America. In other words, the circumstances of his life allowed him to live and thrive off the grid of these transcontinental networks of control and exchange, and also excluded him from accounts focused on the history of transnational lives lived under the constraints of empire. Despite the colorful cosmopolitanism of the time, the process of settling in Mexico wasn't easy for him. Unlike other countries in the Americas like the US, Argentina, or Brazil, Mexico was never, during the 19th or 20th centuries, a nation of immigrants. An official rhetoric based on the idea that certain races were unassimilable to the Mexican nation gave shape to restrictive laws during the opening decades of the century. The increasing rejection of Asians sparked notorious incidents of violence, especially against Chinese communities in the north of Mexico. Kankoje, however, had several advantages. Trained as an agricultural scientist, he was in a position to contribute decisively to the consolidation of a prosperous and modern national agriculture. At the same time, as we have already said, it is perhaps not too adventurous to suggest that the ambiguous position held by Indians in the racial categories of the time, defined by amorphous categories like black, Asian, or white, could also contribute to his assimilation in the country. His story points to important ambiguities and contradiction of Mexico's policy of mestizaje, a nationalist ideology based on the conviction that Mexican identity stems from the union of pre-Hispanic and European heritages, that is, Indian and Spanish blood. Towards the end of his life, Kankoje was reportedly fond of saying that after 3 decades in Mexico, working along campesinos, he had become doubly an Indian, making reference to the land of his birth and also to one of the pillars of Mexican mestizaje. Indeed, the names of his 2 Mexican daughters testified to this unlikely trajectory, Ana, Savitri, and Maya. Beyond the narrative richness of his fascinating life, Pandurang Kankoje's itineraries and trajectories present us as historians with important questions. On the one hand, his unknown story shows that marginality and subalternity have historically often been contingent rather than fixed markers of identity. Similar to many other subalterns moving through the networks created by colonialism during the early 20th century, for Kankoje, liminality did not necessarily translate into powerlessness. Despite the many hardships he endured, he went on to become an important and affluent member of the scientific community of an independent Latin American country. However, as the return to his homeland made painfully clear, national belonging did not always translate into acceptance and fulfillment. The final stretch of his life was marked by disenchantment. Having returned to India at the end of his life, Kankoje felt unappreciated and out of place in the country of his birth. Militant nationalism then is not always rewarded with the comforts of nationality, and the end of colonization did not always bring fulfillment. In the little time that I have left, I'd like to talk a little bit more about other aspects of his life that I hope can lead to an interesting and fruitful conversation at the end on histories of migration, also internationalist histories more broadly. I'm trying to write more and research more on his role, not only as a migrant and a scientist, but also as a teacher, and his role in the creation of what he called the Free Schools of Agriculture, an initiative spurred by a novel brand of campesino internationalism linked both to the thrust of the Mexican Revolution and the Crestintern, or Communist Peasant International. Pandurang Kankoje's role as a teacher and director of these schools was captured by 2 of the most emblematic artists of the time, Tina Molotti and Diego Rivera. The Italian photographer Molotti registered the Indians' scientific experiments at the National School of Agriculture and documented his work for most of the 1920s. For his part, Rivera, one of the most famous communist painters of the 20th century, included a depiction of Kankoje in his monumental decoration of the Public Education Secretariat building in downtown Mexico City, which you can still go and look at today in the city. As a result of his inclusion in the work of these 2 artists, Kankoje secured a place in the history of revolutionary art and became part of an iconographic and symbolic universe simultaneously rooted in the fertile ground of early post-revolutionary Mexico and nurtured by the ideals of 1920s radical internationalism. Born in Italy in 1896, Molotti moved to California in 1913, around the same time as Kankoji, and settled in Mexico in 1923, just a year before the Indian migrant. In Mexico, Molotti developed a work that depicted the materiality and corporeality of everyday life for the workers in Mexico City, but also created a novel iconographic universe that came to be intimately tied to Mexico's radical politics. She had a keen eye for symbolism and her ingenious blending of Mexican sombreros, the sickle and the hammer guitars, and other Mexican symbols generated powerful images of a localized yet internationalist revolutionary movement. Molotti began documenting Kankoji's work of plant inbreeding and genetic modifications at the National School of Agriculture. In her photographs, Kankoji is presented not as a campesino worker, but as a scientist. However, he does not appear as an emissary of science detached from the real problems of the peasants. Rather, he is portrayed in the fields, tenderly holding the growing stalks of corn, the staple crop of the Mexican diet and central symbolic element of the pre-Hispanic indigenous civilization. The image of Kankoji, presented by Molotti, reflected beautifully his commitment to the promise of his work and the ethos that permeated the creation of new scientific and pedagogical structures in post-revolutionary Mexico. Here we can see him. That's him with the suit in the fields of central Mexico. Kankoji also inspired Diego Rivera. During the 1920s and 30s, Rivera brought together communist, nationalist, and religious symbols in the confection of images that became essential for the consolidation of the symbolical legitimacy of the regime, and also the creation of a new revolutionary mythology. A convinced believer in the political function of art, Rivera aimed to explain and make things comprehensible to the masses. His monumental murals included representations of Emiliano Zapata, Lenin, Trotsky, Cuauhtémoc, Buddha, and other historical and mythological symbols, which blended iconography of communism with Mexican nationalist and populist motifs. Rivera included an image of Kankoji in the panels of the education building. We can see him here. These murals were organized around the celebration of the Mexican Revolution's achievement in agrarian reform, symbolized in the celebratory centrality given to the figure of Emiliano Zapata. Here we can see a panel of the building called Our Daily Bread, or El Pan Nuestro. This panel presents an image of the Indian migrant and scientist presiding over a table before a very mixed and expectant group of people. The attendants at this fictional supper include old men, children, men, women, indigenous, mestizos, and Westerners, proletarian and campesinos, forming a collectivity that clearly speaks of Mexico, but also of the world beyond it. Dressed in a simple denim shirt decorated with the red star, Kankoji is breaking a loaf of bread and preparing to distribute it among the attendants. Behind him, we can see an oversized allegorical figure of a dark-skinned woman carrying a tray of fruits and vegetables on her head. On either side of the Christ-like scientist stand a soldier and a peasant, two emissaries of the triumph of the Mexican revolutionary struggle. Like in Molotti's photographs, the Indian is presented here with a serious yet gentle expression. However, whereas in the Italian photographer's work, Kankoji was always presented as a man of science, here he's converted into a metaphorical image of the provider of life and bread. The blending of Christian and communist elements fits nicely in Rivera's attempt to create a new revolutionary mythology. However, the image of Kankoji here does not speak of a past, but speaks of a brighter future in which classes, races, and communities come together to break bread under the helm of the militant communist scientists. In this sense, the presence of Kankoje, an Indian imperialist and committed teacher, serves to highlight the local processes of the Mexican Revolution as well as its internationalist efforts. Throughout his life, and with this I will end, Pandurang Kankoje played a part in different revolutionary movements. During the 1920s, his difficult and unique position as a British Indian subject in post-revolutionary Mexico meant that, unlike many exiles which he knew and worked with, he was unable to focus on the politics of his homeland, and thus free to focus entirely on local causes. Unable to leave, Kankoje adopted Mexico. During the following 30 years, he organized politically, formed a family, constructed a successful scientific career, and led a life beyond the reach of British surveillance. As we have seen, Kankoje was devoted to bringing together issues of peasant radical politics with broader agendas of political transformation. As a result of his involvement with movements ranging from Swadeshi and Ghadar radicalism to Soviet communism and Mexican agrarianism, Kankoje brought together a wide range of ideological tenets in defense of very local yet international projects. In this sense, and in a beautifully paradoxical manner, he managed to harmonize his itinerant condition as a migrant and his deep concern for land and local situated issues. It is no wonder that Kankoje's life is so little known, both in India and in Mexico. His story can only be understood as part of an internationalist history with global repercussions, the likes of which we can now begin to write together. I will stop the sharing of the screen and leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danielle and to Andrea, for both of those wonderful presentations. To me, they show the impacts of South Asian migrations in a global historical context in different ways, both the, to some degree, obvious effects of the globalization of labor in ways that often are not analyzed, that Andrea has so wonderfully done, as well as through the hidden histories, I think, of individuals like Kankoje, which have such a range of impacts on many different kinds of projects, as you mentioned, Danielle, the history of internationalism, the histories of different kinds of solidarities, and the histories of politics that lay outside, I think, of the national or the colonial frameworks that are more familiar in histories of migrations as well as histories of the modern world. So I'd like now to pose a question to both of you that would allow us maybe to go a bit deeper into these histories, framed by a broader reflection as a question that I would invite both of you to think about how the historical presence of South Asian migrations from the 1830s onwards impacts your respective areas of geographical specialization or your current disciplinary location. Both of you talked a bit about this, but I would invite you both to say a bit more. And I'll just offer a few more details of how I'm thinking that will then allow you perhaps to respond in some detail. Now, with Andrea's case, the historical anthropology of the Middle East and the Gulf is undoubtedly informed by migrations of people from South Asia at different levels and in political and in various other ways. The topic, as you've studied it, remains somewhat sidelined in mainstream discussions of South Asian history. And in the course of your research in South Asia and in the Middle East, I'm wondering if you could speak a bit about how the topic was perceived by your informants, the social life of this topic, as well as by officials in government capacities. Where do you feel that the study of this topic is going within the Middle East and beyond? And in Danielle's case, though you work on aspects of international history as well as the history of India, but are based in Mexico and offered a whole variety of very interesting reflections on the kinds of connections between India and Mexico that are quite historic, how might the historic presence of migrants from South Asia potentially broaden the scope of Mexican history today. Recently, many cases have been revealed of so-called, quote, extra-continental migrants from South Asia heading toward the United States vis-a-vis Mexico. And though the contemporary context differs greatly from the world of Kankoje, could you speak a bit more about how Mexico and India hold longer-term relationships, at times made visible by migrations of Kankoje's type or perhaps others? So I'll stop there, and then I'll turn to Andrea.
So thank you for those excellent questions. As I was thinking through the question, I became struck by how often when we think about like labor history or even labor movements, we think about them in relationship between citizens and the state in claiming rights. And so how I think when we're thinking about, maybe not today, how migration from India to the Gulf is perceived, but historically, I think because it's happening by working class individuals who are outside the actual confines of the nation state, I think sometimes it's not thought of as being part of the dominant history of the nation state. You know, it's and I think it also, one of the things I really took away from both Neilesh, your chapter, and Daniel's chapter about like with these microbiographies or these microhistories or biographies are this idea of the tensions that were occurring between like expansive ideologies of like communism and or revolutionary politics, and then there's a tension between that and then a nationalism or, you know, something that's more like exclusive or exclusionary, and how those were playing out in their particularly the first half of the 20th century. But today, I think often when migration to the Gulf is talked about, it's often because it's migrants go on short 2-year contracts and then return, it's often thought of as both kind of not part of the story of like India. When I would talk with government officials, they would often talk about like, you know, in migrants as being India's brand image abroad. And so the, you know, the best type of Indian, you know, like the best image of India abroad would be a doctor in the United States, they would tell me, not, you know, a migrant. And that was in part why the regulation of immigration was still important. It was both to protect vulnerable people who were seen as vulnerable or more likely to experience worker abuse, but also one government official told me it was because there shouldn't be Indians begging on the streets in the Gulf because that would hurt India's image. And so I think often it's seen as something to be managed, but not something that's necessarily central to the story of India today and its development. But in contrast, workers or laborers often see their work as like very central to the development of India and its future, and how they're contributing to their families and they're paying for their sons and daughters' educations and helping buy farming equipment and all these things. And so I think a lot of it has to do with one's perspective and what story one is telling there. But I'll continue to think about it and let Daniel talk, because I don't want to take all the time, but it's a fascinating question.
Great, thank you. Danielle.
Hi, yes, oh, thanks. Thanks, Neilesh, and thanks also, Andrea, for your presentation. I mean, regarding my own work and concerns, it's very, first of all, very difficult to pose this kind of work in a place like Mexico, no? And for me, what's become clear writing this chapter and reading this book is that histories like that of Kankoje can help us make the history of migration less fixated on nationalism, no? After all, migrants are I don't know, it has to be more focused on, for me, global migration studies can help us look at migration in more regional terms, not only in like specific national regions, but also in greater global regions. For me, for example, it's fascinating to see how this can help us relink Mexican histories with histories of the so-called West Indies, no? The Caribbean, which in Mexico no one calls the West Indies, but it is also called the West Indies in other places of the world, no? Places like Belize, which is right here at our southern border, but also Cuba, Jamaica, Trinidad, Guyana. All these places are basically absent, invisible in our historical imagination. And I think histories like those in your book can help us think of that a little bit more. And also, I think there's another issue what we could call like reflected histories, no histories that not necessarily link through specific or visible channels or networks, but that develop in tandem or in parallel. For example, the history of the word India or Indian itself, brings together the West and the East Indies, but also current contemporary populations in Mexico referred to as Indios, or Indians, and the histories of colonial Western imagination contrasted with local trajectories of racism and exclusion in places like Mexico and other countries of Latin America. That's a very broad subject, but I think it's a way of in which we can start thinking of history not necessarily as empirically demonstrable, but also as more intuitive and kind of thinking of our work as not directly related to empirical evidence, but to other kinds of trajectories like words and imaginary places and things like this. Also, there is the more urgent political issues nowadays of migration. Mexico is a transit place for populations from all across the world. We have reports of thousands of people from Bangladesh and Nepal and India, elsewhere, crossing through Mexico. And that's, I think, a deeply concerning process and deeply violent process, but I think of a more political nature. Maybe we can talk about that if the audience wishes to talk about that, but that's radically changing the face of migration policies, violence here, exclusion, racism, and we are starting to become a more xenophobic country. After complaining for decades of xenophobic countries in the first world, we are now being revealed as more xenophobic towards these other Indians coming from other places of the world. But I mean, I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Daniel. I think I will now turn over to Ben.
Great. Well, thanks to all the authors for really just bringing out some rich texture to their work. As a reminder to the audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A or the chat function, which is on the right-hand side of your panel. We have a couple of questions there. Please do also identify yourself and any affiliation you might have, as that will help us perhaps locate the questions. So I'm not going to abuse my position as moderator and ask the long list of questions which I've come up with listening to these fascinating stories, but rather there's actually a couple of interesting questions in the chat already that really echo each other that I'd like to put together. And I'm going to actually combine the one from Kyle Marston as well as from Arzina Lakhani, both of whom are really interested in the climate change aspect of migration. And essentially what they're asking is, do you see environmental impacts or climate change in your story, both past, obviously this is especially for you, Neilesh, and you, Danielle, and also present for you, Andrea, but also looking towards the future.
I could jump in if I mean, so this is something that comes up a lot in my work because both, I mean, as oil companies in general, like as a place, the perspective of recruiters and oil company human resources managers would often, I would be told that, as a place benefits from wealth from remittances, they want individuals then want too high of a salary to go to the Gulf, and so they have to go to another rural area to recruit workers to go so they can pay the lowest wage possible. So of course, in the context of like environmental degradation and the upheavals that are caused by climate change, and the impact that climate change is having on, in particular, farming in India, this is creates even more people who are desperate, really, for like to support their families. And so this, I think it really, in some ways, somewhat not surprisingly, but climate change produces the conditions in which then people go to work in the oil industry, which of course is connected to climate change. But the other thing I was thinking about Daniel's answer to Neilesh's question about like how we rethink, area studies. And I think that like climate change and migration and these biographies also really provide a really rich area to think about how we imagine communities and community action and who we're working together with. Because of course, the people who suffer the worst from climate change are not those who are producing the condition necessary, like producing, the more carbon into the atmosphere that's causing climate change, right? And so how do we think about who we have responsibility to and with whom we work to like shape the future are some of the questions that emerge for me when we think about global movements and climate change in particular.
Yeah. Can I jump in a bit? Yes, I mean, from the chapter I was just talking about, another fascinating and important aspect of this character Kankoji's life is that he was central to what we now call the Green Revolution. His work as a scientist was kind of a basis for later scientific research that was developed in Mexico and then adapted in places like India, Pakistan, and other places. We know basically two aspects of this. We have two narratives, no? One is this narrative of a great triumph of third world developmental agendas in places like Africa, Latin America, Asia. And the other is this narrative of pillage and accumulation and environmental degradation. But what we can see in historical terms through the history of someone like Kankoji and his comrades and peers is the utopian thrust that was behind all of this, no? And this complicates both narratives because he was neither a nationalist, developmentalist, capitalist, neither third world enthusiast, but the history of climate change and climate migration has to be written not only through the focus, I think, or lens of accumulation and environmental degradation, but also through the lens of the utopian projects that stand behind it, no? In places like northern Mexico, where the agro industry has devastated the environment, no? But also in places like Central America or the Punjab, or I think it is not only, it has to be, in my view, complicated to show how it was indeed a utopian revolutionary thrust that is behind many of these processes, and not only a capitalist process of accumulation, no? Both contribute to this history. I mean, that's my take on this question. Yeah. Andrea?
Well, can I ask though, do you see the like those utopian visions though to be like separate from capitalism, or do you see them to be like a moving through capitalism? Like a progress as opposed to a revolution, I guess would be the question.
I mean, they are separated from private enterprise and private accumulation, at least in places like Mexico. Now they are statist enterprises, which then benefit private hands and private sector. But to begin with, they are part of this broader global revolutionary thrust of modernizing the peasantry and making the life, how did they say, ending the exploitation of man through the exploitation of the land, or something like that we used to say in Spanish. I don't know if this is translating well into English, but it is one of the tragic results of the more utopian and idealist aspects of 20th century third world politics, I think.
I would just want to say really briefly, though, I have very little insight on the environmental impacts of the present, but I would say that some of the insights that we take from the history of the British Empire and its importance in regulating migration patterns, as well as the moment of decolonization and the rise of the nation state, may not show us the kinds of directions that migrations will go toward in this contemporary era. And so those policies and patterns that I have charted out and that are the subject of the kinds of histories that help us understand different solidarities of the past might yield toward altogether new politics of the present. And so those are the kinds of things that I think the scholars of the future will have to come up with new questions to tackle.
That's a great question from the audience, and it also reminds me, given my own specialty on Afghanistan, that there's different drivers of climate change that we can think of. Obviously, the long-term trajectory of climate warming, but also conflict-induced climate change, which seems like it would be particularly germane in Danielle's case, where we see northern Mexico so destroyed by the revolution between 1910 and 1920, which then is reformed by the Green Revolution later. Changing gears slightly, I'm going to pick up on one of my questions. And before I do so, I'd just like to say and remind the audience how nice it is to actually see work that I have seen in progress come to fruition in publication. And of course, that's Neilesh's essay on Taraknath Das, a version of which he presented previously at the Sigur Center a couple of years ago. So it's so very nice to see this out in print and see the imprimatur of some of the discussions have there working their way into this. This is really kind of a broad question for all three of you, coming from your different disciplinary backgrounds as a kind of theorist of political history and political ideas, an anthropologist, and focusing on biographies. But you frame this, Neilesh, as an editor, but also Danielle and Andrea as authors within the frame of global history. I mean, the book is South Asian Migrations in Global History. Yet in a way, the kind of histories we've been talking about are national histories, Indian and Mexican on the one hand, and imperial histories with a labor regime constructed by the British Empire in the Gulf that then, carries on into the present moment. So I wonder if you guys could explain or perhaps think a little bit about, when you put it in a global historical frame, what exactly do you mean by that, and what exactly are you trying to get out of that framing, as it were?
Okay, I can maybe, for me, I'll say that I'm constantly baffled and troubled by the whole global history problem. But in the case of this work, and what I'm trying to do, trying to link Indian and Mexican histories of the 20th and 19th centuries, what I'm trying to do is basically look at colonial and anti-colonial networks and circuits from a different place, basically. Trying to see how history, what we could call global histories of interaction and exchange, intercontinental histories, how they exceed what we have come to know as the standard channels of communication. We have many stories about internationalist, anti-colonial activists in Europe, in England, maybe in other places of the Mediterranean. But how about other kind of processes that link ideologically, politically, and materially places like India and Mexico in the 19th century, which seem to be so far apart? We can look at them through the traditional lens of colonial networks, but we can also look at them through micro-historical perspectives like that presented through Kanko's life. But also, I think that we have to start looking at other kind of global exchanges. I mean, the scientific aspect of Kanko's life is fascinating because he's working with seeds and fertilizers at a moment in which these are not seen as normal parts of, I don't know, scientific and agricultural inputs around the world. So, I mean, basically for me, this image of the global is basically useful for going beyond the standard account of national, colonial and anti-colonial networks that we already have, no? And I think that there's much work to be done, especially linking not only India, but Southeast Asia and China with Mexico, North America, seeing also Mexico as a part of North America, not as separated from the West Coast. No, they were very much part of the same place. So yeah, I mean, that's what I could answer to that. Thanks.
just to build off of like what Daniel ended with, I was recently reading Wang Wei on 1989 in China and the Tiananmen Square, and it was reminding me of like, how do we narrate our histories, and what events do we see as being similar versus like unique? And I think that one of the things one of the strengths I think of global history is being able to put events into conversation with each other, that if we just look at them within like a national or framework, they might seem very disconnected, but may in fact be responses to capitalism or certain like shifts in economic or environmental conditions. And then I think that this also follows with like, when I look at historically at worker solidarities, those solidarities don't always follow the, neat boundedness of a nation or of a linguistic group or something, but rather often are quite messy, and I think that that is really hard to get to attend to and really engage with if we think about things as being too bounded by the lines of colonial powers or by states. So those would be my thoughts on that.
I'd just like to add to both Danielle and Andrea's comments that I see the term global history here as not offering a positive content necessarily, but as being that space where the national histories and the imperial histories are pushed and they're challenged by the kinds of material that we have access to. So it is at the edges of, it is at the challenges to nationalism, imperialism, as well as those structures of history that these stories, these individuals, and these processes tell us about. And it is out of that we would create new histories. So though I don't know if there is necessarily a global history of all of these developments, but put together, they are histories that challenge pre-existing histories. And that is where the global term for me enters. And there isn't really a term that can categorize all of this together coherently, but it is those histories on those edges that I think obviously have great significance, but have yet to be put together into one space.
Well, one of the nice things about the book as an edited volume is that, sometimes edited volumes can be outcomes of conferences where they just kind of include the papers who decide to submit without an overarching logic, or the logic comes after the volume itself is constructed. Whereas the nice thing in your book is that there's a clear logic and at the same time tension within the book, that these are not necessarily neatly fitted and neatly nested, as it were, fragments that reinforce one another. They have linkages to one another and are juxtaposed next to one another to both show the similarity and the globalness, as it were, of them, but also the disjunctures, that we don't tell a story of coherence and clear linkages, that there are interruptions, and that the story changes along the way. That's I think, one of the real strengths that come through this work as a whole, but also in the individual contributions to the work. We have time for one more question, and this is from a PhD student at JNU, Heba Ahmed. She's got actually a two-part question, one of which is specific to you, Neilesh, and then the other I think you can all take a crack at. So I'll start with the one for Neilesh, and then return to finish up with the one for the panel as a whole. And Neilesh, what Heba asked is, working on immigration of Bahari Muslim laborers to colonial Calcutta, her basic thrust of the question is, where are the histories of Bahari and Urdu-speaking populations of Calcutta and their connection with immigration history? Because so often this is focused on specific groupings within South Asia. So even though we talk about South Asian immigration or even Indian immigration, we are actually talking about subsets within that. More broadly, the point that I think you can all address is, how do we address the challenge of writing the unwritten history? That many of us deal with populations who are not largely literate, and whose traditions or histories themselves have either been ignored or are lost to the written word. So how do we recover those? So I'll start with you, Neilesh, and then we can open it up to finish on.
Great, thank you so much for that question and for your framing of it, Ben. So I'd say there's a lot to say, so I'm going to try to be as concise as I can. The history of colonial Bengal, as the person asking the question well knows, is almost suffused with this intensive focus on regional history, histories of nationalism, and histories of Bengali-speaking people, often histories of Bengali Hindu-speaking people, a part of which I have attempted to critically engage in by doing works on Bengali Muslim-speaking people, often left out completely of the history of colonial Bengal and the history of colonial Calcutta. In the history of labor, I would say, speaking to a point that Andrea made, often the histories of laborers that are not seen as situated in a particular place, the history of Bihari Muslim people in Calcutta, those who work in Calcutta know very well about this history. It's very important to the history of Calcutta, but it is difficult to situate into a history of a bounded place, often because labor is not fixed into one's understanding of place. And to add to that, again, to speak again to some of Andrea's points, the history of Muslims in terms of a social history as well as a labor history in India is fraught with a whole number of political concerns, and is often treated as a history not so much of a place, but as a history of a particular process disconnected from, let's say, the history of Calcutta, though of course it isn't. And I would say that as one way of dealing with this challenge of writing these unwritten histories is to revert to a history of place that is just enlarged. So a history of a region in Calcutta, that of Garden Reach, the place that was the center of the depot of indentured laborers in the 19th century, also was the place where part of Nawab Ali Shah's retinue was taken right before and during 1857-58, and the site of many labor histories of different types that often get ignored in mainstream nationalist histories of Calcutta, might be the site of a new labor history. And that, I would say, would be part of the future project of doing these sorts of histories that are obvious to those who have relationships to these places, but often don't have a space in mainstream historiography. It would also speak to some of Danielle's points about how history is not only a space of empirical accumulation, it is a space of thinking about what is both unwritten but felt within these spaces like Garden Reach or various other parts of Calcutta that cannot be experienced without the Bihari Muslim labor history or the histories of many other migrant groups that often don't get connected with an idea of Calcutta in the mainstream. I'll leave it at that.
Danielle, Andrea, any comments on the unwritten history?
Go ahead, Andrea.
I mean, I think Neilesh said it fantastically. I think that that's always the challenge of thinking about like what assumptions are we making, as we approach the archive too, and who, trying to brush, I guess, against the archive as one's reading is, perhaps also a methodological tool. But yeah, I'm not sure I have anything to add beyond what Neilesh said.
I'm very sorry. Also, I don't have much to add because I don't really know that much about labor history or the labor history of Bengal or Calcutta. But I'm very sorry for not being able to say anything productive. But yeah.
Daniel, I think you don't do yourself justice. You've told us quite a bit about the unwritten histories that we have been unfamiliar with, and you've done quite a chore in writing up some of those histories and introducing us to paths hitherto unexplored. I see that we've come up to time, so I'd like to thank the panelists for sharing their time and insight, and more importantly, for writing an absolutely fantastic book. Again, it's South Asian Migrations in Global History, Labor, Law, and Wayward Lives, published by Bloomsbury Academic Press. You can get it just in time for Christmas, Hanukkah, or whatever holiday you do support/celebrate on Amazon, amongst other places. And I should also, it would be remiss of me not to give a special shout out to Andrea, who just had her own research monograph published earlier this week by Stanford University Press, Between Dreams and Ghosts, Indian Migrations and Middle Eastern Oil. It sounds to me like we have a future New Books in Asian Studies talk with that one as soon as we can get that on the calendar. So I know we cannot give you guys the hand clap in person, except I'll put my little reaction there on the screen. Thank you so much to the audience for joining us wherever you are. And thank you to the panelists, and we look forward to seeing you at our next installment of New Books in Asian Studies.